and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine.
What's going on internationally? How do we get to the place where, Putin decides he's going to...
There is an important point that needs to be made in regards to U.S. foreign policy and a history or a pattern of needing plausible deniability and how the U.S. goes about doing that. And this is in regards to recent comments made by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin regarding the ongoing Israeli military operation in Gaza. And we go to this article from The Hill. Israel risks strategic defeat if civilians aren't protected, Pentagon chief says. And the article says, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said Israel risks a strategic defeat if it does not work to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza amid its war on militant group Hamas in the region. The center of gravity is the civilian population, and if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. The secretary added that he has personally pushed Israeli leaders to avoid civilian casualties, prevent violence to settlers in the West Bank. We will continue to press Israel to protect civilians and to ensure the robust flow of humanitarian aid, he added. His comments come as U.S. leaders become more vocal in warnings to Israel about the next phase of military operations in Gaza after a temporary truce expired. The Biden administration has issued caution that a campaign in southern Gaza must be carried out more precisely than Israel did in the first leg of the war. So who believes that the United States suddenly cares about civilian lives? And who believes suddenly the Pentagon has this desperate desire to be honest with the global public, global audiences, after so much denial in regards to the U.S. proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, denial that continues to this day, as a matter of fact. If we go to liveuamap.com, their Israel-Palestine live map, again, keep in mind that this is a pro-Western website. We can see how Israel is completely encircled and contained northern Gaza. We've watched them flattening northern Gaza over the last several weeks. And now we see these incursions in southern Gaza. And what it looks like, and what I had warned people about at the beginning of this operation, was this is about erasing Gaza. This is about eliminating the Palestinian people in Gaza, Israel occupying Gaza, and all the while using Hamas as a pretext. And all while U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is making these comments about avoiding civilian casualties, a flood of arms and ammunition from the United States to Israel continues, and it is entirely enabling continued military operations in Gaza. And I've gone over this article before, and it talks about before, during, and in the near future, this flow of weapons from the U.S. to Israel. Bloomberg, U.S. is quietly sending Israel more ammunition and missiles. The article says Pentagon has quietly ramped up military aid to Israel, delivering on requests that include more laser-guided missiles for its Apache gunship fleet, as well as 155mm shells, night vision devices, bunker buster munitions, and new army vehicles, according to an internal Defense Department list. The weapons pipeline to Israel is extending beyond the well-publicized provision of Iron Dome interceptors and Boeing Company smart bombs. It continues even as Biden administration officials increasingly caution Israel about trying to avoid civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip. Again, here the U.S. is urging Israeli restraint, all while enabling Israeli brutality, indiscriminate brutality. And we know that it's indiscriminate because Israeli military officials announced at the beginning of these military operations that it would be indiscriminate brutality. And again, I've gone over this article many times from The Guardian. Emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. Ground offensive into Gaza seems imminent. And this was October 10th. And so this was before Israel entered into Gaza and encircled northern Gaza. It says IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari made the startling admission that hundreds of tons of bombs had already been dropped on the tiny strip, adding that the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. This has nothing to do with eliminating Hamas. Israel, even in their own media, have entire articles about how, especially the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu, was deeply invested in maneuvering Hamas into power, and the whole purpose of doing so was to prevent peace, to continue hostilities, to create a perpetual pretext for Israel to brutalize the Palestinian people, to justify military operations exactly like this. They don't want Hamas to disappear. The point of keeping Hamas in power in Gaza is to prevent negotiations that will lead to an inevitable two-state solution. And again, we go back to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin saying Israel faces a strategic defeat. But that's only if their objective is the defeat of Hamas. If it's to erase Gaza, I think they're well on their way to success. Hamas is no actual threat to Israel. It's self-preservation. It is a small militant group. It has, yes, this global network, but it has no ability to actually threaten the existence of Israel. Even the October 7th raids and all the damage that was done, in terms of self-preservation or even temporary military readiness, it had a negligible impact on Israel. Another point that I want to make here is that U.S. policymakers, when they're trying to provoke a war, and that is exactly what the U.S. is trying to do. They used a war they provoked in Eastern Europe to cut ties between Europe and Russia and force artificial dependencies on Europe between themselves and the United States. And now they're trying to do something very similar in the Middle East. They're trying to provoke a war, but they want plausible deniability while doing that. They want the public to believe that the U.S. is seeking peace while someone else is the one provoking war. And I've covered this many, many times before, and I will cover it again. This is a 2009 policy paper from the Brookings Institution, Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran. And if you go through the table of contents, you're going to notice there's an entire chapter right here, chapter 5, Leave It to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. The U.S. wants war with Iran, and they are willing to use Israel as a provocation toward that war, to get Israel to start it so it looks like the U.S. had nothing to do with it, all while actually encouraging and enabling the Israeli provocation and then wading into the conflict after it begins. And this is what it said about, in general, provoking war with Iran, which they admit Iran does not want with the United States. It would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. They're admitting that they are provoking a war with Iran, but they want the world to believe it was Iran that provoked the war with the United States. They understand that certain provocations would be so obvious that there is this absolute necessity for plausible deniability, which is why, again, they have a whole chapter dedicated to using Israel as the provocateur. It continues, it says, one method that would have some possibility of success would be to ratchet up covert regime change efforts in the hope that Tehran would retaliate overtly or even semi-overtly, which could then be portrayed as an unprovoked act of Iranian aggression. So they're talking about lying to the public, and they will use their control over the Western media to do that. It also says, in a similar vein, any military operation against Iran would likely be very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context, both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. The best way to minimize international opprobrium and maximize support, however grudging or covert, is to strike only when there is widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer, one so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down. Under those circumstances, the United States, or Israel, says, or Israel in parentheses, could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger, and at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it on themselves by refusing a very good deal. So do you see how plausible deniability, provoking a war, but convincing the world that they had nothing to do with this, that they are the victims, they are not the aggressor, they are the victim, that factors in heavily all throughout U.S. foreign policy. We see them manufacturing one pretext after another regarding one war after war, all throughout recent U.S. history. If you take the logic and the methods of U.S. foreign policy demonstrated very clearly, admitted openly in this 2009 paper, and you apply it to the conflict happening in Gaza right now, it is abundantly obvious that the U.S. is intentionally and eagerly enabling Israel. Israel could not conduct these military operations without U.S. military and also political support. There's quite a bit of political support too, despite the rhetoric regarding restraint and protecting civilian lives. They're using this operation in Gaza to destabilize the region and hopefully provoke a much wider regional conflict. And the U.S. wants to look like it's the only one in the region calling for restraint, and that when this conflict begins and it has to wade in on the side of Israel, it does so just as it says in this Brookings paper. They had to do it in sorrow and not anger, that they had no choice. In terms of the upcoming U.S. elections, I also hear this often. You know, the U.S. sees how unpopular this Israeli military operation is in Gaza. They're trying to pressure Israel to stop it because it's going to hurt President Joe Biden's re-election bid. Just think back to the Iraq War, the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, how utterly unpopular that was, and how it was going to completely ruin the Bush administration's chance at re-election. And President Barack Obama even campaigned on a platform of ending the war in Iraq. But we saw how even when Obama came into office, he not only didn't end the war in Iraq, he expanded it. He expanded the conflict in Afghanistan, and then he began several more conflicts in Libya and in Syria. U.S. foreign policy is not shaped by the people in Congress or in the White House. It is written up in these corporate-funded think tanks. They go to a team of lawyers who craft it into bills, who send it to lobbyists, who bring it to Washington and have everyone sign off on it, often without even reading it. And then they go to the media, and the media convinces the American public that this is all in their best interest. That is how foreign policy is actually crafted. Elections have absolutely no impact on how it is implemented. The only thing that will change is the rhetoric and spin used to sell the public and the world the same exact foreign policy as it continues uninterrupted, regardless of who sits in the White House or who is running Congress. Go look at the Brookings Institution's website. They have a list of all of their corporate and financier sponsors. These are the unelected interests that are actually determining U.S. foreign policy. And I said they're unelected, which means no matter who you vote for in Washington, these interests and the policy that they want is what Washington is going to do. One final point, even though these comments by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin are completely disingenuous and are meant to deflect away from the central role the U.S. plays in enabling Israeli military aggression in Gaza, the fact that he's talking about targeting civilians, it confirms the nature of the fighting in Gaza and the fact that Israel is brutalizing the civilian population. But again, this should come as no surprise because even the Israeli military itself admitted as they began these operations that it would be a campaign of indiscriminate brutality. We'll keep an eye on all of this and how it develops. Please just keep in mind that the U.S. is not suddenly going to become honest with the public or suddenly care about civilians. When you hear them talking like this, it should immediately ring warning bells of all kinds, and we should try to figure out what they're actually trying to achieve by saying this and by pushing the blame on Israel. And we have entire policy papers where they admit that they want to use Israel to provoke a war that they themselves can wade into later and fight. So until next time, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to the channel. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for other places you can find and follow my work. There are also ways there in the video description below where you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been, whether it's month to month, through one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, all of that helps. That's what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.